comes from 2 Samuel chapter 11, beginning at verse 1. In the spring of that year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to fetch her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her home. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house. David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live, and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, so that he may be struck down and die." The word of the Lord. On June 19, 1982, in Detroit, Michigan, Vincent Chin was having a bachelor party before his wedding on June 27th, when he got into a heated argument with a man named Ronald Ebbins, a Chrysler plant supervisor. Later, Ebbins and his son-in-law, Michael Nitz, tracked down Vincent Chin and found him at a fast food restaurant. They attacked him. Ebbins beat Chin with a baseball bat while Nitz held him down. Chin went into a coma, and 4 days later he died. Ebbins and Nitz were arrested at the scene by two off-duty police officers who witnessed the beating. After a plea bargain deal with the court, they were convicted of manslaughter, but served no jail time for their crime. Ebbins had been distraught over the loss of U.S. auto manufacturing jobs to the Japanese and took out his frustration on Vincent Chin and killed him. Vincent Chin, however, was not Japanese. He was Chinese. More on that later. When the nation of Israel demanded that the prophet Samuel anoint a king over them, they had given up on the rule of judges. Judges were those charismatic leaders who arose from one of the 12 tribes of Israel, usually during a crisis. The problem, however, was that with judges was that a judge was both the leader of the military and the leader of the faith. So if a judge sinned, there was no one to call him or her to account. The kingship that Samuel began when he anointed Saul as the first king of Israel effectively divided authority between kings and priests. So when King Saul sinned, Samuel was on the scene to call him to account for his actions. Saul admitted his sin, and this is what the people had hoped for: accountability in leadership. But what would happen now that the prophet Samuel was gone? Samuel had anointed both Saul and David as king, but Samuel had died by the time David had his affair with Bathsheba. This blatant sin of David was the first post-Samuel test of this still new division of power between kingship and priesthood. Would the new prophet confront the king? Would the new king submit to being called to account for his sins? No one knew. The answer to these questions were far from certain at the beginning of the scandal. First, Nathan, the prophet, who came onto the scene, would not only face the uncertain reaction of King David if he confronted him, but he also faced the vast conspiracy of silence surrounding David's affair. Both David and Bathsheba had sent messengers to one another, David to inquire and send after Bathsheba, Bathsheba to announce to David that she was pregnant. Only David's correspondence to his military commander Joab to arrange for the death, really the murder of Uriah, was the Hittite, had been done secretly. Though the people certainly would have been able to guess what was really going on. Anyway, everybody knew about the affair, but they knew not to talk about it openly. The prophet Nathan not only would have to confront the sin of David, but also the pressure from the royal court to remain silent, to not make any waves, to protect David. Because after all, if this affair with Bathsheba led to the downfall of David, a new king would mean a new royal court. Second, even if David retained power after his affair was exposed, no one knew how he would react. He could deny the affair despite it being widely known and accuse the priests of a conspiracy to destroy him and call on the army to punish them, just like he had called on Joab to arrange for the death of Uriah the Hittite in the first place. So what do we learn from this drama surrounding King David's sin and the second generation of the division of the power between king and priests? We learn this: it worked just as it had been designed. Yes, the prophet Nathan had to move quickly, and if you haven't read, it's the next part of the story. If you can't bring it to mind, I would commend it to you later today. Read what happens after these verses we read earlier. Nathan had to move quickly while the armies of Israel were away and could not be called upon to quell in any dissent. And Nathan, in essence, tricks David into condemning himself by presenting David's sin disguised as a story, but it worked. David admitted his sin publicly and accepted his punishment. The division of power between king and priesthood had survived into a second generation and had worked as designed to call a king to account for his sins and to be restored to his role as the leader of the people of God. God further fulfilled his promise to David not to reject him when he sinned, like he had rejected King Saul, but to punish him and to restore him to the kingship. All, it seems, had worked out well in the end. And yet, there's one lingering question, one seemingly small detail that remains unanswered. How is it that King David, the quintessential political game player, made such an egregious error of judgment in his decision to have an affair with Bathsheba, who was a married woman? Now, some scholars suggest, well, it was just that power had gone to David's head. He simply considered himself above the law, since he was, after all, the king. In this familiar scenario, David simply went beyond the bounds of the law, and the prophet Nathan called him back in. David did not go beyond the law at all. Instead, he simply defined it too narrowly. A lawyer once asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" This lawyer wanted a legal definition of who he was obligated to, quote, love as himself, unquote, in order to satisfy the second half of the greatest command, right? First, to love God with all your heart, soul, and might, and second, to love your neighbor as yourself. But like most Israelites, David had a ready answer for this question, who is my neighbor? My neighbor is the one I am obligated to love as myself, David might say, is a member of my community, a fellow member of the faith. I owe nothing to foreigners. Uriah, who was a Korean immigrant from the Pacific School of Religion and studied this text a while back, saw the importance of this one detail in the story of David and Bathsheba. Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, was a Hittite, not an Israelite. He was a foreigner. You see, once David found out that Bathsheba was married to a Hittite, a non-Israelite, he simply assumed he had nothing to fear. He owed nothing to a non-Israelite. He believed, quite literally, that he could get away with murder. As Vincent Chin, from my opening story, slipped into a coma after his beating, he whispered to a friend, "It's not fair." Certainly, Uriah the Hittite's treatment was not fair either. Both Chin and Uriah the Hittite, by all accounts, were legal immigrants, hardworking and loyal to their adoptive nation. Likewise, however, both were victims of attackers who narrowly defined their neighbor as members of their own nationality. Yet if King David believed that God intended God's laws only to apply to Israel, he was sadly mistaken. God had promised many years before to Abraham that through Abraham, all families of the earth shall be blessed. God intended his chosen people, Israel, to be a blessing to the nations, not a curse, who would take away their wives or kill them unjustly. Likewise, as Christians, we claim to be heirs to the promises of Abraham by our faith in Christ. God has chosen us not only for our own sake, but also so that God may be a blessing to the families of the world through us. So as we gather to worship God, let us ask ourselves, who is the neighbor who Christ calls us to love as ourselves? Will we, like King David and others, narrowly define our neighbor as our own nationality? Will we, like remain silent like David's court or like our own judicial system in the case of Vincent Chin, and hesitate to call attackers to account? Friends, there are no national boundaries to God's or Jesus' definition of neighbor. The church is called to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. We are called, like Nathan, to break the conspiracy of silence and proclaim the truth. Uriah the Hittite was the neighbor of David. Vincent Chin and all other innocent victims of such attacks are our neighbors as well. Our faith in Christ is not a privilege that allows us to narrowly define our neighbors as our friends or to love only those who love us. But it is a responsibility to broaden the scope of our neighbor and to see in Uriah the Hittite or in Vincent Chin not the face of a foreigner, but the face of Jesus Christ. Let all God's people say,